In this module, we're going to be discussing using multiple reverbs on the same source, why we might want to do it, and how we would execute it. Now, is using multiple reverbs on the same source a rule break? Is it a new concept? Where does it even come from? Well, it's actually something that engineers have been doing for a very long time, probably well before the 80s, but I'm going to say that in the 80s, that's when it started to become kind of a popular thing. It coincides with the role of a mix engineer becoming a dedicated position, because before that, most engineers were both tracking engineers and mixing engineers and kind of just the engineer. But mixing started to become an actual profession really around the 80s. And once people were being hired to do lots of records for mixing, it was very common to have a customary console setup, certain pieces of gear that were preset. And the effects returns in particular would be set that way. So it would be very, very common for a studio to have a couple of echo sends normal to a chamber, an EMT plate, and then maybe 2 or 3 digital reverbs that would come up on the effects returns. And so if you were setting up your mix, you had your vocal, then you would just pull up the echo send, turn up the aux that you wanted, and then you would just ride up the faders, and then suddenly your short plate is coming up, your long haul is coming up, and if you have them all on one fader, then it makes sense that as the engineer, you might pull up the short plate and you might say, okay, that sounds good. What happens if I just tuck up a little bit of the long haul behind it? And you might go, oh, that sounds good, and probably not overthink it. Now, I'd like to kind of technically break down what's going on and why that works, but for the most part, I think that engineers were just doing it because it sounded good, and it's really no deeper than that. So let's pop into this, let's take a listen to this dry vocal, and let's start crafting what we would want from a reverb, because no matter what kind of techniques we're using, it always has to come from the point of view, what do we want the reverb to be doing? Why do we want a certain sound, and what is that sound? All right, let's check it out.
Cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes sola, y a mí yo le llego siempre a cualquier hora. Mi cama solo quiere lo que él no valora, yo solo te miro a los ojos y quiero hacerlo ahora, mamá.
Okay, so this dry vocal to me sounds pretty good, but it's a little bit bland feeling. It's also a little bit weirdly two-dimensional because there's a fair amount of reverb going on in the synths in the background. So I want a reverb that's going to help the vocal feel connected to the track. I want a reverb that's going to be colorful, maybe give this vocal a little bit of life. And then I also really want to make sure that I'm preserving the rhythmic intention of this vocal. That's very important to this style and to the way this delivery is being done. So if I were doing this with one vocal, or with one reverb, the way that I set it up was with this Lex Random Hall, and I have everything kind of timed and customized to just kind of work. Now I'm going to play the reverb back a little bit louder than it should be, just so that we can hear it clearly, but you'll hear one reverb working.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes sola, y a mí yo le llego siempre a cualquier hora. Mi cama solo quiere lo que él no valora.
So there's a nice color to that. There's sort of this like synthy wash to it that I feel blends with the other reverbs that are present in the record. In general, it works. But could it be better? Absolutely. There are certainly a few things that we could get out of it. Now, from there, I want to go into some multiple reverb techniques and approaches, and then kind of explain where they come from and how they might work and what might work best for this record. All right, let's take a look at the customary one. The very, very common to reverb technique is the short plate long haul combo. Basically, the science behind it, which, you know, not the most important thing in the world, but just for edification, because of the nature of plates, you get all the high frequencies up front. They're really, really good for making things pop. In addition, plates tend to be not really perfect. The pickups on the actual plate, it's very hard to get them to be exactly symmetrical, and even 1 millimeter of shift can really separate stereo image. So a short plate gives us something where a lot of pop and a lot of texture comes right up front, as well as a lot of width. Now, when you have a lot of pop and texture and width, it's also taking up a lot of room. So if we have that going on for a long time, then the reverb is going to eat up a lot of space in the mix. But if we take a long haul that has a slower attack time and it's darker, then it's going to take up less space in the mix, but still create the impression of a longer tail. And so therefore, it ends up being like we get a lot of reverb in a very tight, controlled way that has a lot of personality, and then just a lot of smooth tail that allows the reverb to feel bigger, but still blend really nicely. So I'm going to show this example here. I'm going to use the space convolution of a short EMT 140A. And I'm going to combine that with the Relab LX480L. And the way that I like to set this up, and the way that I believe it's usually set up, is the one reverb and the second reverb kind of trade places, going from the earliest to the latest reverberation. So it's almost like airplanes. As the EMT 140 is landing, the Lex Hall is taking off. And I think that's an important part of this formula. So let's play just the EMT 140.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, si que quieres también lo sé.
Alright, so pretty short, but gives a nice little flavor to the vocal, a little organic quality with the texture, a little bit of like high frequency pop to it. Now let's play the Hall.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer.
So while there is some high frequency in the Hall, it's generally a lot darker, and I'm also going to have this a lot lower, so it's a little bit subtler in the mix. And now I'm going to play the two together, and remember, I am exaggerating how much reverb would normally go on this vocal, just so we can kind of clearly hear what's going on.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, si que quieres también lo sé.
Now, we're hearing mostly the plate, but watch what happens when I take out the Hall.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar.
We lose all that tail that makes it feel like the vocal is connecting to the longer reverbs that are within the track itself. Another good way to think about this is we can almost think of the short plate as like the early reflections of one more complicated reverb, and we can kind of think of the long Hall as the late reflections of this more complicated reverb, and then we can control the portionality how we want. Another way that I've heard this done is with a chamber and a digital plate, but the ideology behind it is a little different. Chambers have a very dimensional sound because they are an actual recording of actual space. That realism is really very useful in creating a sense of reality, but sometimes we also want a sense of romanticism or something that's surreal, and so we can get some of the flavor of a digital, more colorful kind of reverb that feels synthier and more extraterrestrial or something like that, and combine it with the realistic dimension. A really good example of this is Adele's vocals in the song Hello. The main reverb that we're hearing is a combination of real chamber and also digital, I think Bricasti, but I'm not positive, but a digital Hall of some sort. So here I'm using a convolution again of a chamber, but this would be better illustrated with an actual real chamber return. I just don't happen to have a chamber at home. And then again the Relab, and this is set a little bit differently. So here my Relab is kind of acting as the short plate. This is an ambience. It's going to be very tight. It's going to put a color around the vocal, and it's going to sound like this.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se...
But I'm just using that very subtly to make the chamber feel a little bit less real. Now, here's the chamber reverb.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer.
And like a chamber, it is a much more small-sounding, boxier-sounding space. It feels a little bit more dimensional, although this is not like the greatest convolution of a chamber. There are certainly more realistic ones out there. But now, here's the combination of the two.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, si que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, si que quieres también lo sé.
So really, really pretty color to it, a very romantic kind of flavor to it, very emotional kind of flavor to it. Again, you know, for a reference, Adele's Hello is a really good way to do it. I feel like any song where it's supposed to tug at your heartstrings, this is a really great combination. And it sounds nice on this vocal too. I don't know if this is the appropriate record for it though. All right. Now, more importantly than these techniques, it's how we extrapolate from these techniques, right? We break down the technical idea of why something works, and then we can reinvent it to our own choices. So for example, if we know that something is working because we're getting all the high frequency up front, we're getting all the spread up front, and then the rest of it is working because we have this darker tail that blends in nicely, we can kind of exaggerate those ideas. So a lot of the times, the way that I do this short plate, long haul technique is a little bit of my own variation. And I'll use the Bricasti Percussion Air preset to act almost as if it's my early reflections, because it is very, very bright. It's like an exaggerated version of what I would hope to get from the plate. So I'll play that.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que...
It almost doesn't sound like reverb. It's so tight. It's like just this like really, really beautiful set of early reflections that pops. Then to get my tail, I'm going to go for not a long haul, but a similar thing to a long haul. It's the East Church, which is one of the presets in the Bricasti as well, and I'll play that for you in addition.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también.
So it's got a lot of personality to it, very colorful, but definitely on the darker side to it. So I'm going to now play this in the mix together, and you'll mostly hear the church.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé.
Now, without the percussion air.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé.
Notice that the reverb just suddenly becomes kind of flat and bland. Well, that's because at the level that it's coming in and the way that I'm using it, it's kind of supposed to be a little flat and bland. Where the pop comes from is actually that percussion air, and you don't need a lot of it. It's subtle, you don't really hear it, but suddenly the vocal just kind of wakes up.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también.
But more important than the actual sound of it, although I do find that this particular combination works really, really well, and feel free to simply just take it and use it for yourself, but more importantly, it's the concept of getting all of that really exciting stuff that would take up a lot of space in the mix right up front, and then it's quickly decaying and gone, and then just using something that blends much more nicely for our longer reverb so that, you know, we can have the best of both worlds. Now, you can take this and you can make your own versions where you pick the stuff that you like specifically, and you go, okay, this is now part of my signature approach, or you can completely flip this. There's no law that says that your upfront sound can't be something that's very warm and dark and then decays quickly, and then your longer sound is actually something that's kind of icy and bright. You're going to get a very, very different effect from that, and I encourage you to try it and experiment, because experimentation, that's how we learn. We learn when we do it, not when we hear it. All right. Now, another approach to this entirely is to just simply find the things that we might want from a reverb and then use the reverbs that we want to create the best impression of that. So for example, one of the things that I would really want from my reverb in this vocal, and because of the style and the delivery, is something that's very, very rhythmically helpful. So here I'm picking a reverb specifically for rhythm. I've got it timed to a 16th note triplet. And so this is going to sound really unique and interesting.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes sola.
So you hear that it has a very distinct rhythmic quality to it. However, it's not something where I could rely on it for the entire sound of the verb for this vocal. It doesn't really totally connect. So I'm going to use less of it, and then very, very subtly I'm going to use this other reverb, and I'm only using it for depth. I'm going to turn this up, and then I'm going to break down what it's really doing, but you'll notice I had it at like minus 17 dB, so it was very quiet.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar.
So it's a very long reverb with a very slow attack time. It's the concert wave preset from the Bricasti, and I'm going to turn it all the way down. Basically, this reverb is way too dark and way too long to be the primary reverb for this track. But let's hear where I have it set.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar más.
we barely hear it. But now let's bring in the combination of the two. The rhythmic one, that's brighter, and then this very long, dark, slow attack reverb just kind of hiding in the background.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes sola.
Might not have been expecting it to sound that good, right? All right, we're going to add one more layer here, and that's a texture layer, right? We need to make this vocal feel like it pops a little bit more, a little more colorful here. So I've got a couple of different texture layers that I pulled up. One is almost like a chorusing kind of effect. I'm going to turn it way up so we can hear it.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes.
So it's like super modulated. It's this ambience chorus preset with some slight tweaks going on with the feedback and the delay and things like that. It's like between a reverb and a chorus, like kind of straddling both. So that's obviously not our primary reverb, but with just a little bit of it underneath everything else, they all come together and they form something really cool.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes sola.
I mean, even with the reverb up too loud, it sounds really good and it feels really good. I would say of all of the reverbs we've heard, I really like this combination the best. Better than what I actually used in the actual mix, which, yeah, regrets. Oh well. But I want to show you one other texture too, because this is another reverb that I think is really cool, and I can't really ever use it on its own because it's such an unbelievably unique sound, but it's the Eventide 3000 Shimmerish preset. And what it does is it has very, very long early reflections that are spaced far apart and very discrete. And then it's got a late reflection window that's basically the same timing as the early reflection, but it's incredibly, incredibly diffuse. So you get this mixture of like very discrete echoes and like very, very diffuse tail that come together in a really, really unique way. I just have to play it because it's hard to imagine.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar.
Right, so it's totally weird. You don't necessarily notice that like very diffuse tail until I actually stop the playback. But then you hear it. It's got that very sizzly, icy kind of top thing going on. It provides a lot of pop, a lot of texture. It's like a very super printed reverb. But again, if I had this up and this was the only reverb on there, it would be way too distracting. So again, I can just kind of tuck it down so that we just get the feel and the texture of it, combine it with my rhythmic reverb and my depth reverb, and then suddenly we get this 3 reverb combo that sounds like this.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes.
Which is a really nice sound. Now, of all my preferences so far, I prefer texture A with the depth and rhythm layer. I still like that a little bit better, but it's just to show that there's a lot of ways that we can do it. We basically take the things that we like and then make sure that we can blend them together in a way where they don't end up masking each other, right? That's the real skill of it, finding the right levels for each thing and customizing each one so that they're working together really nicely as like one really great textured, rhythmic, depthy reverb. There is one other thing that I want to show, which is a little bit more pragmatic than it is creative, but one of the reasons we can use multiple reverbs is if we're not getting enough out of the reverb that we have. So let's say we only have R-verb, for example. R-verb is a really good reverb if you want a reverb that steps out of the way of everything. That's why I like it for tracking. It's very, very transparent. But that said, it does not add a lot of flavor. It's not a lush reverb. It's very one-dimensional and usually not my preference for vocals. If I turn it up,
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también.
it's not a very lush reverb. Even at an extremely loud volume, it still doesn't feel like it's stepping over anything in the mix, which again can be genuinely very useful, but it's just not useful if we're looking for color or we're looking for something to sound really lush. However, if I use two instances of reverb, and they're timed differently, and using different correlation values and different sets of early reflections and different modulation points, what we end up getting is two reverbs that are moving out of time with each other. And so they chorus, they modulate. And one of the ways that we can kind of fake lushness in a digital reverb is through modulation. It's what makes the 480L such a great sounding and colorful reverb. It's that inherent modulation that we get. So if we combine two instances of our verb, we can actually get a much lusher sounding reverb. Check it.
En mi cama podemos conversar, nos podemos conocer, sé que quieres probar, mamá. Lo que yo quiero no se puede explicar, solo se puede hacer, sé que quieres también lo sé. Con él tú sabes que te sientes sola.
Now, do I think it's a substitute for like a good 480L or a good Bricasti or something like that? No, but I do think that it is an improvement over what we have, and if we have limited resources just because of our circumstances, what we have, you know, maybe we're at a studio, we're working, and they don't have a lot of plugins or whatever it might be, you know, if that's all we've got, we can still use a little creativity to create a combination of reverbs that create something that's more colorful and more interesting than just the straight-ahead reverb is by itself. All right, guys, like I said, the real secret to learning here is to actually put it into practice. So develop your own multi-reverb techniques. And here's the little bit of caution. We always have to be objective about what we're doing. Sometimes we get a creativity bias where we do something that's really unique and it's interesting intellectually because we're making it. We're putting this effort into it. And sometimes that can taint our view as to whether or not what we've actually done sounds good. So you do have to remain objective. You can absolutely use multiple reverbs to make a mess of a sound and it won't sound good. So you have to just keep in mind that just because you did something doesn't necessarily make it good, but spend a little time with it and you might find that you can get something really unique and better than what you would otherwise get just using singular reverbs or more customary approaches.